I left London around 7 in the morning with Asher in the passenger seat and a printed checklist folded in my jacket pocket. The job was straightforward enough that I'd done the prep in under an hour the night before. Structural survey of the Mosul Army sea forts, documentation for a heritage preservation nonprofit, putting together a report for Historic England. One-day camera, measuring tape, clipboard. I'd done similar work on decommissioned industrial sites before. This was just farther out. Asher had his laptop open before we even cleared the M25, reading aloud from regimental records he'd pulled off some archive database. He did that sometimes. Got enthusiastic about the historical angle. 7 interconnected platforms, he said, scrolling with one hand. Built in 1942, anti-aircraft emplacements. They were crewed by Royal Artillery men who lived on the structures for months at a time without shore leave. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. The traffic was light heading south, which was the only reason I'd scheduled the job for a weekday. Weekends brought day trippers to Southend, and I didn't want to sit in gridlock Roudir with a boat captain charging hourly. 3 deaths between 1942 and 1945, Asher continued. 2 listed as accidents, one just says found. Found where? Doesn't specify, just says Private Samuel Harding found 14th of August 1943, Fort 3 lower compartment. He glanced over. That's the one we're starting with, isn't it? It's first on the checklist. He went back to reading. I filed the information away under historical context, the sort of thing that would go in the introduction to the report. Clients liked that. Made the work sound more substantial than measuring rust and checking for structural compromise. We stopped for petrol outside Basildon. Asher bought coffee and a sandwich he didn't finish, and I topped up the windscreen washer fluid because the forecast had rain later, and I didn't want to be driving back in the dark with a smeared windscreen. The sky was low and gray, the kind of October morning that never really gets bright. The marina was small, tucked into a side channel off the estuary proper. I'd arranged the boat hire through a contact at the firm who'd done coastal surveys before. Blake Schmidt was waiting on the dock when we pulled into the car park, standing beside a mid-sized workboat with a canvas canopy and an outboard that looked older than I was. He didn't shake hands, just nodded when I gave my name and told us to load our gear. I handed down the equipment cases while Asher climbed aboard, and Blake stowed everything forward without comment. He was maybe 55, stocky, with the kind of weathered face you get from years on the water. Didn't say much. Didn't need to, I suppose. We'll need to get alongside the dock on Fort 3, I said, unfolding the site map. Survey starts on the upper platform and works down to the base struts. Blake looked at the map, then at me. I don't go alongside those. I waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. The access ladder is fixed to the dock, I said. We'll need to tie off. I'll bring you in with the tender. He gestured to an inflatable dinghy lashed to the stern. You go across in that. I stay offshore. It wasn't what I'd arranged. The tender added time and an extra transfer, and it meant Blake would be charging us for the full duration while sitting idle 300 meters out. I opened my mouth to argue, then decided against it. Local boat captains had their reasons, usually to do with insurance or tidal access or some other thing I didn't need to understand. I'd charge the extra to the firm and let Alfred deal with the invoice if he had questions. Fine, I said. How long to get out there? 40 minutes. We cast off just after 9. The estuary was flat and gray, the water the same color as the sky, and the fog sat low enough that I couldn't see the far shore. Blake ran the boat at a steady pace, not fast, and Asher went back to his laptop, reading more about gun emplacements and supply runs and the rotating crew schedules that kept men on the forts for 8-week stretches. I didn't listen closely. I was watching the fog. The forts appeared slowly, materializing out of the gray, like something in it that had always been there, but only just decided to be visible. Rusted towers sitting on massive concrete stilts, connected by catwalks that sagged in the middle. 7 of them in a loose cluster, each one identical in shape, but different in the degree of decay. Some had lost their railings. Others were missing entire sections of platform. They looked like they'd been planted in the estuary and then forgotten, left to rot in place, because no one could be bothered to dismantle them. Blake cut the engine and let the boat drift, while he prepped the tender. Asher packed his laptop away and pulled on his waterproof jacket, checking his radio and camera. I did the same, clipping the radio to my belt and making sure the checklist was sealed in a plastic sleeve. The transfer to the tender was awkward but manageable. Blake ran us in close to Fort 3's dock, holding position while we climbed out onto the ladder. The metal was slick with algae and salt, and I kept one hand on the rung above me the whole way up. The upper platform was bigger than it looked from the water, wide enough for 4 men to stand shoulder to shoulder, with rusted gun mounts bolted to the deck and a low structure that might have been a command post or sleeping quarters. Everything was orange with corrosion, flaking where the wind had stripped it down to bare metal. Asher started immediately, pulling out his tape measure and notepad. I worked through the checklist, photographing the gun mounts and the deck plating and the catwalks that connected Fort 3 to Fort 4. The fog hadn't lifted. It sat around us like something solid, muffling the sound of the water below. That's when Asher started tapping. He'd knock his knuckle against a copper pipe or a strut, then pause, listening to the sound it made. Then he'd key his radio and narrate the result. Strut 7, upper junction sounds solid, no hollow resonance. I ignored it the first few times. Then it started to grate. Pipe 14, moderate corrosion, partial flaking at the joint. Asher. He looked over. Yeah? You don't need to narrate every single test. It's cluttering the audio record. He grinned. I thought you liked thorough documentation. I like documentation I can actually use. If I need the sound, I'll ask for it. Fair enough. He went back to work, quieter now, though I still heard him tapping every so often. Just didn't narrate it. That was fine. I didn't care what he did as long as it didn't end up on the recording. We worked through the upper platform in silence, moving between the gun mounts and checking the catwalk connections. The metal was cold even through gloves, and the fog made everything damp. I could hear Blake's boat engine idling somewhere offshore, a low, steady rumble that didn't quite fade. Around 11, Asher moved to the edge of the platform and looked down at the flooded lower compartment. The stilts that held Fort 3 above the waterline were hollow, and the lowest section had flooded decades ago. The checklist called for photographs of the base struts, which meant someone had to go down there. I'll take it, Asher said, already pulling the rope ladder from his pack. You finish up here. I didn't argue. He was lighter than me, and he didn't mind the confined spaces. I helped him secure the ladder to the railing, and he climbed down into the dark, his headlamp cutting a narrow beam through the flooded compartment below. His radio crackled. Water's about waist deep. Struts look intact, but I'll need to get closer to check the welds. Copy, I said, moving back to the gun mounts. I kept working. The fog hadn't moved. The forts sat in it like something that had always been there, rusted and silent and enormous, and I had no reason yet to think there was anything wrong with them. Asher's voice came through the radio again, easy and conversational. Corrosion's heavier down here than I expected. I'm seeing pitting on the lower. Then his voice dropped. It went down into a register it could not physically reach. A sound like gravel scraped across metal, and it finished his sentence without pause. She's been here since the guns. I stopped. My hand was still on the camera. Then Asher's normal voice came back, bright and unbothered. Craig, you want these measurements in metric or imperial? I keyed the radio. What did you just say? Metric or imperial? For the corrosion depth? Before that. A pause. I asked if you wanted the measurements, that's all I said. I stood there on the platform with the fog pressing in and the radio silent in my hand, and I didn't know what to do with what I'd heard, so I let it go. Metric, I said. Copy. I went back to the checklist, but I kept the radio volume up and I listened. I kept working through the checklist because that was what I was there to do. Fort 4's upper platform had a section of railing that needed photographing, and the corrosion pattern on the support struts was worth documenting for the report. I moved between stations with the camera and the measuring tape, logging dimensions in the notebook, keeping the radio clipped to my belt where I could hear it. Asher's voice came through every 10 minutes or so. He was down in the flooded compartment of Fort 3, working his way through the base struts, and he called up progress reports the way he always did on jobs like this. Water depth, visibility, structural integrity. His tone was steady and professional, the kind of voice you'd use to dictate notes you knew someone else would have to transcribe later. I was measuring the thickness of a corroded beam when his voice came through again. Corrosion's progressing faster on the submerged sections. I'm seeing... Then it dropped. It went down into a register that didn't belong in a human throat. The sound was like metal scraping over concrete, low and grinding, and it finished his sentence without breaking rhythm. She's been here since the guns. I stopped moving. My hand was still holding the tape measure against the beam, but I wasn't reading the numbers anymore. The radio was clipped to my belt, and the voice that had just come out of it was Asher's and also wasn't. Same cadence, same pacing, but the pitch had gone somewhere it couldn't physically go. Then his normal voice came back, bright and unbothered, like he was picking up mid-thought. Craig, you want these measurements in metric or imperial? I stood there for a few seconds. The fog was thick enough that I couldn't see Fort 3 from where I was standing. Just the catwalk stretching away into gray. I unclipped the radio and keyed the transmit button. What did you just say? Metric or imperial for the corrosion depth? Before that. There was a pause. Not a long one, but long enough that I thought he might have heard it too, whatever it was, and was trying to figure out how to explain it. I asked if you wanted the measurements, that's all I said. I didn't know what to do with that. I'd heard it clearly. The voice had been wrong in a way that didn't have a mechanical explanation, not interference or a bad connection or anything I could write down in a report. But Asher didn't remember saying it, and I didn't have a framework for pressing the issue that wouldn't make me sound like I was hearing things. So I let it go. Metric, I said, and copy. I went back to the checklist. I finished the measurements on Fort 4 and moved to Fort 5, photographing the exterior struts and logging the corrosion depth in the notebook. Asher's voice came through the radio twice more in the next half hour, both times normal, both times reporting exactly what he was supposed to be reporting. I kept the volume up and I listened, but nothing else came through that didn't sound like him. By early afternoon, I needed to charge the camera battery. The charge was down to 8%, and I had another 3 platforms to document. I needed a dry surface and a power source, which ruled out most of the forts. Fort 3 was flooded. Fort 4 had no intact electrical infrastructure. Fort 5's control room had a ceiling leak that had turned the floor into a slick of rust and standing water. Fort Ruff's was different. It had been the self-declared Principality of Sealand since 1967, which meant parts of it had been maintained. Not well, but better than the others. There was a generator that still worked, and the upper rooms had been kept dry enough for habitation. I crossed the catwalk to Fort Roof's and climbed the ladder to the upper platform, looking for a table or a bench where I could set up the charger without risking water damage. The control room was at the center of the platform, behind a steel door that had been painted red at some point and then left to flake. The door was ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, with a single window looking out over the estuary. There was a table against the far wall, a metal folding chair, and a shelf with a few books on it that looked like they'd been left there decades ago and never moved. The air smelled like rust and old paper, and the floor was dry. I set the camera on the table and plugged the charger into the generator outlet. The charge light came on, steady and red. I was about to leave and let it charge when I noticed the logbook. It was sitting open on the table, right next to where I'd set the camera. A hardcover notebook with a black cover, the kind you'd use for inventory or shift logs. The pages were yellowed but intact, and the handwriting inside was neat and deliberate, each entry dated and signed. I didn't touch it at first, I just looked. The first entry was from 1978, a salvage crew, 4 names, there to strip copper wiring from Fort 4. Below their names, someone had written a single word in different handwriting. Stayed. The second entry was from 1981, a journalist and a photographer documenting the Sealand claim for a magazine. Same thing. 2 names followed by stayed in handwriting that didn't match the entry above it. I turned the pages. 41 names across 17 visits. Survey teams, salvage crews, journalists. A few entries that didn't list an affiliation at all, just names and dates. Next to 36 of those names, someone had written stayed. Different handwriting every time, like each person had written their own annotation and then left it there for the next person to find. I kept turning pages, and then I reached the last entry. Asher's name was there, written in his handwriting, neat and slanted to the right, the way he always wrote. The date was today's date, October 14th, 2023. The ink was dry. Below Asher's name was my own. Same handwriting, same ink. Craig Brown, written in a hand that looked exactly like the stayed entries on every page before it. Below my name was a blank space. I stood there, looking at it, and I understood what the blank space meant. It wasn't a gap waiting to be filled in later. It was a condition, a status. The 36 names with stayed written next to them had been annotated after the fact, which meant someone had been here to do the annotating. Someone who hadn't left. Asher's name was already in the book and the ink was dry, which meant whatever was going to happen to him had already started. My name was there too, but the space next to it was still blank, which meant I hadn't stayed yet. Not yet. I picked up the logbook. I didn't think about it, I just did it. Because it was the only piece of evidence that was real and portable and mine. I tucked it inside my jacket, zipped it closed, and unplugged the camera even though the battery was only at 23%. Then I keyed the radio. "Asher, where are you?" His voice came back immediately, calm and unbothered. "Still in the flooded compartment. I'm almost done with the lower struts. Come up. I've got maybe 10 more minutes of work down here. Come up now." There was a pause. Then his voice came back, quieter this time, like he was trying to figure out if I was serious. "You all right? Just come up. Copy. Give me 2 minutes." I left the control room and went back out onto the platform. The fog was thicker now, sitting low over the water, and I couldn't see Fort 3 from where I was standing. I could see the catwalk, though, stretching away into gray, and I could see the faint outline of Fort 4 beyond it. I started moving. I moved fast. I didn't run because running on those catwalks would have meant falling, but I moved as fast as the rust and the gaps in the metal would let me. The fog was heavier now, sitting right on the platforms, and I couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. The catwalk swayed under my boots, and I kept one hand on the railing because the other was holding the radio and I wasn't letting go of it. Fort 3 came back into view through the gray. I could see the hatch where Asher had gone down, still open, the ladder disappearing into the dark. I keyed the radio. "Asher, are you up yet?" Nothing came back. Just static. I reached the hatch and looked down. The ladder was wet, same as before, and the compartment below was flooded to the same level it had been when I'd watched him descend that morning. I couldn't see him from where I was standing. The angle was wrong. I climbed down. The water was cold enough that I felt it through my boots before I reached the bottom rung. It came up to mid-shin, black and still, and the smell was worse than it had been from above. Salt and rust and something organic that had been sitting in the dark too long. The compartment was narrow, maybe 8 feet across, with struts running floor to ceiling and conduit pipes bolted along the walls. The only light came from the hatch above, and it didn't reach far. Asher was standing in the center of the compartment with his back to the ladder. His arms were at his sides, not relaxed, but held there, like someone had positioned them. He wasn't moving. "Asher." He didn't turn. His voice came out instead, flat and steady, the same register it had dropped into over the radio. Strut E7, corrosion index 4.2, strut E8, corrosion index 3.9, strut E9, corrosion index 4.1, strut E10, corrosion index 4.4. The same 4 measurements, the same cadence. He finished and started again immediately, no pause, no breath between. Strut E7, corrosion index 4.2, strut E8, corrosion index 3.9. I stepped forward, the water dragging at my boots, and reached out to touch his shoulder. The fabric of his jacket was damp and cold under my hand. I said his name again. He turned. His eye sockets were empty. Not closed, not damaged. Empty, like something had scooped them clean and left the skin intact around the edges. His mouth was open, and I could see copper wire inside, coiled tight in a perfect cylinder, packed from his teeth to the back of his throat. The same copper he'd been tapping all morning. The same copper he'd narrated over the radio in that voice that wasn't his. I let go and stepped back. My boot caught on something under the water and I almost went down, but I caught the ladder and held on. Asher didn't follow. He just stood there, his head turned toward me now, his mouth still open, and then his voice came out again in that wrong register. Strut E7, corrosion index 4.2. I went up the ladder faster than I'd gone down it. My hands were shaking, and I didn't stop to wipe them dry. I got to the top, pulled myself through the hatch, and started moving. The catwalk to Fort 4 was the same stretch I'd crossed a dozen times that morning, but the fog had thickened, and I couldn't see the far end. I kept my hand on the railing and moved as fast as the rust would let me. Halfway across, I saw the figure. It was standing at the junction where the catwalk split toward Fort 4 and Fort 5. A man in a Royal Artillery uniform. Wool serge, brass buttons, the kind Asher had described from the regimental records that morning. The fabric looked intact, not rotted, and the buttons caught the light even through the fog. Its head was turned to the side, bent at an angle that didn't match the way a neck is supposed to sit, and its arms were extended in front of it, palms up, holding two round pale objects. I stopped walking. I didn't mean to stop, but my legs wouldn't move forward, and I couldn't make them. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, holding what it was holding. And I knew what they were before I let myself finish the thought. I turned around and went back the other way. Fort 4 was the same layout as Fort 3, just less flooded. I pushed through the lower compartment and came out on the far side, then crossed to Fort 5 without stopping. My chest was tight and my hands were still shaking, and I pulled the camera out of my jacket because if I was going to get off the forts, I needed something that proved what had happened. Something that wasn't just my word against the fog and the rust and whatever was standing at the junction behind me. I turned the camera on and pulled up the image gallery. The first photograph that came up wasn't mine. It was the flooded compartment of Fort 3, shot from floor level looking up at the open hatch. The light from above was dim and gray, and the angle was wrong. Too low, like the camera had been sitting in the water. The date stamp in the corner read 14th August 1943. I scrolled to the next image. Same photograph, same angle, same light, same date stamp. I kept scrolling. Every photograph I'd taken that morning was gone. In their place was the same image, repeated over and over, 412 times. I checked the count twice because I didn't believe it the first time, but the camera didn't lie about that kind of thing. 412 copies of the same photograph, all taken on the 14th August 1943, all looking up at a hatch I'd climbed through 79 years later. I turned the camera off and put it back in my jacket. My hands were steadier now, not because I was calm, but because I'd run out of room for shaking. I needed to get to the dock. Blake's boat was still tied off. I'd seen it from Fort Roofs before I'd found the logbook, And if I could get to the dock, I could get off the forts. That was the only thought I had left that made sense. I checked the route from Fort 5 to Fort 6. The catwalk was intact. I crossed it and came out on the upper platform of Fort 6, then moved to the exterior side to find the ladder down to the dock level. The ladder was gone. Not collapsed, not rusted through. Gone, like someone had unbolted it and dropped it into the water. The dock was 30 feet below, and I could see the hired boat still tied off, rocking slightly in the current. The tender was there too, pulled up alongside. Blake had known not to come alongside the forts themselves, and I understood now why he'd refused. He'd known something I hadn't, and I hadn't asked the right questions. Every path to the dock ran through the junction where the figure was standing, or it ran through the water. I went back inside and found the logbook still tucked inside my jacket where I'd put it. I pulled it out and opened it to the last page, just to confirm what I already knew. Asher's name was there, written in handwriting that matched the stayed entries. My name was below it, followed by a blank space. I closed the logbook and tucked it back inside my jacket, zipping it closed. It was the only evidence that was real and portable and mine, and I wasn't leaving it behind. Then I went back to the exterior railing of Fort 6 and looked down at the water. It was black and still, and 30 feet was far enough to break something if I landed wrong. My shoulder was already sore from carrying the equipment all morning, and I didn't know if I could swim with a dislocated joint or a broken rib. But the junction was behind me, and Asher was still standing in the flooded compartment, repeating measurements in a voice that wasn't his, and the logbook in my jacket had a blank space next to my name that wouldn't stay blank unless I moved. I climbed over the railing. I went over the railing. The water hit me wrong. That's the best way I can put it. I'd been braced for cold, and I'd been braced for the impact itself, but I hadn't accounted for how 30 feet gives the surface time to feel like concrete when you're falling toward it with no room to adjust your angle. My right side took it first. The shoulder joint separated on contact, and the pain was immediate and total, the kind that doesn't build or spread, but just arrives fully formed and sits there like a weight you can't put down. I went under. The water was black and cold enough that it felt thick, like something you had to push through instead of move in. My right arm wasn't responding. I kicked hard and broke the surface, sucking in air that tasted like rust and brine, and the hired boat was maybe 20 meters off, still tied to the dock where Blake had left it. 20 meters. I could do 20 meters. I'd done longer in the community pool in Islington when I was trying to get my fitness sorted 2 years back, though I'd had both arms then and the water had been heated and chlorinated and not full of estuary mud. I started swimming. One arm. Left arm pulling. Legs kicking. Right arm just hanging there in the water, like dead weight. Every stroke sent a fresh jolt through the shoulder joint, and I could feel it grinding in a way it wasn't supposed to grind. Bone moving against bone with nothing in between to cushion it. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes on the boat and I kept moving, counting strokes, because counting gave me something to do that wasn't thinking about how deep the water was or what might be under it, or whether Asher was still standing in the flooded compartment repeating measurements in a voice that wasn't his. 17 strokes, 18, 19. My hand hit the side of the boat and I grabbed the rail with my left hand, holding on while I kicked to keep myself level with the edge. Getting over the side was going to be the hard part. I couldn't pull myself up with one arm, not from a dead hang in the water, and I couldn't use my legs for leverage because there was nothing to push off. I hooked my left elbow over the rail and twisted, using my body weight to drag myself up and over in one ugly sideways roll that sent another spike of pain through my shoulder when my back hit the deck. I lay there for maybe 10 seconds. The sky was still gray. The fog was still sitting low. My jacket was soaked through, and the logbook inside it was pressed against my ribs, a solid rectangular shape that I could feel even through the pain. I rolled onto my left side and pushed myself up with my good arm, then crawled to the console where Blake had left the keys in the ignition, because he'd assumed we'd both be coming back. Starting the engine one-handed was awkward, but not complicated. I turned the key with my left hand, and the engine coughed once and caught, settling into a low rumble that I could feel through the deck. I didn't know how to untie the boat from the dock with one functional arm, so I pulled the knife from my belt and sawed through the line instead. 3 hard cuts, and the rope fell away into the water. Then I pushed the throttle forward and the boat moved, pulling away from the dock in a wide, sluggish arc that straightened out once I got the wheel sorted. I got 200 meters out before I looked back. Asher was standing on the exterior railing of Fort 3, not slumped, not hanging, standing upright with his arms at his sides, facing the water, watching me leave. The distance was too great to see his face, but I didn't need to see it. I knew what was there and what wasn't. He didn't move. He just stood there on the railing like he was waiting for something, and I knew if I went back, he'd still be standing there, and the junction would still have the figure in the 1942 uniform, and the logbook would still have my name, with a blank space next to it that wouldn't stay blank. I didn't go back. I kept the throttle forward, and I kept my eyes on the gray line of the shore, and I didn't look at the forts again. The marina came up fast. I brought the boat in too hard and clipped the edge of the dock. But it didn't matter because I was already moving, left hand on the rail, pulling myself up onto the dock before the boat had fully stopped. My legs felt wrong, shaky. I walked to the marina office and used the phone on the counter to call 999, and the woman on the other end asked what service I needed. "Police," I said. "An ambulance. There's been an accident." She asked where I was, and I told her. She asked what had happened, and I told her my colleague had gone into the water at the Monsell forts, and I'd had to leave him there because I couldn't get him out. She asked if I was injured, and I said yes. Dislocated shoulder. And she said someone was on the way. Constable Catherine Castro arrived first. She was maybe late 30s, dark hair pulled back, wearing the kind of expression that suggested she'd done this before and knew how to move through it without wasting time. She asked my name, and I told her. She asked what had happened, and I walked her through it step by step, keeping it simple. Asher and I had been conducting a structural survey of the forts. He'd gone into the flooded compartment of Fort 3 to photograph the base struts. I'd stayed on the upper platform. When I went to check on him, he was in the water, unresponsive. I couldn't get him out on my own. I went over the side to reach the boat and dislocated my shoulder on impact. I started the engine and came back to the marina. She wrote it all down. She asked if I'd seen how he'd gone into the water, and I said no, I hadn't been in the compartment with him. She asked how long he'd been down there, and I said maybe 20 minutes, not more than 30. She asked if he'd been wearing a life vest, and I said no. Neither of us had been, which was stupid in hindsight, but we'd been working on stable platforms and hadn't planned to go near open water. She didn't ask about the logbook. She didn't ask about the photographs. She didn't ask what I'd seen at the junction or what had been standing on the railing when I left. I didn't offer. The ambulance came next. Dr. Ethel Graves was the one who looked at my shoulder, first at the marina and then later at South End University Hospital after they'd loaded me into the ambulance and driven me the 20 minutes south. She was efficient and calm, the kind of doctor who's seen enough dislocated joints that it doesn't register as particularly dramatic. She gave me something for the pain and then reduced the shoulder, pulled it back into place with one sharp, controlled motion that made me see white for about 3 seconds. And after that, it was just a sling and instructions to keep it immobilized for 6 weeks. She asked how it had happened, and I told her I'd gone into the water from a height and landed badly. She asked if I'd hit my head, and I said no. She asked if I was experiencing dizziness or nausea, and I said no. She ran through the rest of the checklist, shining a light in my eyes, checking my pulse, making sure I wasn't concussed or hypothermic, and then she cleared me to leave. They released me the same evening. I took a taxi back to London because I couldn't drive with my arm in a sling, and I didn't want to wait for someone from the firm to come get me. The logbook was still in my jacket, dried out and warped, but intact. I didn't open it in the taxi. I just sat in the back seat with my good hand pressed against the pocket where I'd tucked it, feeling the shape of it through the fabric, and I watched the motorway roll past in the dark. I resigned on Monday morning. I walked into Alfred Carr's office at 9:30 and told him I was leaving effective immediately, and I'd send over my final reports by the end of the week. He asked if everything was all right, and I said yes, I was just making a career change. He asked if it had anything to do with what had happened at the forts, and I said no, it was personal. He didn't push. He thanked me for my time with the firm and said he'd process the paperwork, and that was it. I was out by 10. The shoulder healed in 6 weeks, same as Dr. Graves had said it would. I did the exercises she'd given me, and I kept the sling on for the full term, and I didn't push it. By December, I had full range of motion back, though it still ached when the weather turned cold. The logbook is in a drawer in my flat in Finsbury Park. I check it every few days. The blank space next to my name is still blank. But I know what that means and what it doesn't mean. The 36 stayed entries were written by different hands across 46 years, which means the logbook updates itself, or someone updates it, or something updates it. The blank space isn't a guarantee. It's a condition. And conditions change. I don't know why my name is still blank when Asher's wasn't. I don't know if it's because I left, or because I took the logbook, or because I went over the railing instead of through the junction. I don't know if the blank space means I got out, or if it just means I haven't stayed yet. I keep the light on at night. Not because I'm afraid of the dark, because I want to see if anything changes. If the handwriting appears next to my name, if the logbook adds another entry, if something that shouldn't be there shows up in the flat, and I need to know about it before it's too late. So far, nothing has. The logbook stays the same. The blank space stays blank. And I keep checking, because not checking feels like the kind of mistake you only get to make once.